Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, April 28th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, unpaid bills at DHS are testing how long critical homeland security missions can hold. Plus, modernizing preparedness law means asking whether long-standing systems are built to last over time. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Army recently launched a new initiative aimed at rapidly delivering artificial intelligence tools to soldiers. Dubbed Project ARIA, short for Army Rapid Implementation of Artificial Intelligence, the effort will initially focus on three areas: automating the Army's planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, or PPBE process, building a model armory, and improving supply chain management. The Army will partner directly with top AI firms to deliver solutions in months rather than years. For more on the project, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Deputy Undersecretary of the Army, David Fitzgerald.
ARIA is the Army Rapid Implementation of AI. I think there's obviously a general view that we have to move faster to deliver the best capabilities to the warfighter. And I think Secretary Driscoll has really pushed us to kind of shift the paradigm on how we approach that problem. And we have a theory that one of the hacks to do that is through better, more effective collaboration with industry. So, how can we cut red tape, take a different approach to requirements so that we're not overly prescriptive, and kind of just take the problem to industry and let them solve it. And by doing that, by really being the problem subject matter experts and sort of enablers to industry, we can unlock the strategic comparative advantage that is resident in American industry. And so we approached this problem when, back in September, Secretary Driscoll hosted an AI TTX at the Pentagon. We invited 20-ish CEOs of some of the leading, American players in this space, as well as industry generally, both on the kind of manufacturing, supply chain side, but largely in the tech space. And I think we did some back-of-the-napkin math. There was about $17 trillion in enterprise value sitting around the table. And really kind of just wanted to prove the concept that we could move more quickly by adopting this approach, and presented them with several operational vignettes, like, here's our problem statements in these areas. How would you guys solve these? And that led to kind of three lines of effort coming out of that. One of them was Team Black, which is creating a model armory for, use of AI models at the tactical edge. There was Team Gray, which is automating and integrating AI into elements of our PPBE process, which is planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, which is really the kind of backbone of how decisions are made, how things get resourced through HQDA. And then Team Yellowstone is developing a digital twin of our organic industrial base, and they've started that effort down at Anniston Army Arsenal, and the purpose there is to establish an AI-enabled supply chain. So we were able to take these things, these ideas or these problems from concept in a conference room to fully resourced projects that are on the rails and beginning to deliver capabilities to warfighter within, 100 days. And so that's lightning speed for the government. And I think even our industry partners have been impressed at the speed with which we've been able to move. But really the credit here goes to our industry partners for their willingness to kind of answer the call, and then, dedicate a lot of time and resources to, blending us their expertise on how to solve these problems. And then the remainder of the credit goes to the trail bosses or the kind of the Army side leaders of each of those lines of effort. Dr. Jason Miller led Team Black, Colonel Patrick Workman led Team Gray, and then Colonel Matt Alexander led Team Yellowstone. So that's sort of the high level background. Each of those lines of effort, has its own kind of POAM or milestone roadmap, but they're all up on the rails and should be delivering, kind of full operational capability within a year. And then I think there's a question on what are the future steps for Project ARIA? Where do we go from here? And I think we think of it as sort of sequels and branches. And the sequel is each of those three lines of effort, and we can get into more detail here, should in a future state kind of converge into one overlapping effort where Team Black is able to push, the operational units are able to push data back from the edge. And so that would give us a real-time view of like what repair parts we need, what we need to change in terms of production or readiness through our organic industrial base. And that would feed into Team Yellowstone. And then Team Gray kind of superintends all that. And how do we make, budgeting and execution and resourcing decisions more quickly, more effectively with better outcomes. And the branches would be, what are new areas that we can kind of spiral off from the baseline that we've been able to set through this initial effort? Like where do we kind of spiral those efforts? So from the PPBE and Team Gray, maybe we look at total Army analysis, but I think the way the vignettes were presented at the tabletop were largely operational focused. And so that's what we have right now. I think there's a world where we obviously have a lot of need for these sorts of capabilities on the enterprise side, both in terms of our financial systems, our personnel systems. There's a lot of utility for, agents, AI agents to come in and streamline some of those processes because a lot of our databases are still reliant on manual data entry. And then we'd like to look at, where are our soldiers in our operational formations spending a lot of time, to input data into disparate databases. And like, how can we streamline that or use AI to lever their time up so that they can spend more time focused on their core operational tasks? So that's sort of the background, the where we're at now, and possible future state at a very high level.
Okay, great. There is so much to dive into. Let's go back to that conference room. And you mentioned that you were discussing problem statements in specific areas. Could you talk about some of the problems that the Army was trying to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them they really distill down into like, how do we become more data centric and reduce cognitive load on operational formations, particularly in, priority theaters where low bandwidth or denied environments are going to be a problem in a large scale combat scenario. So how do we kind of solve the tyranny of distance in the digital space? And so that's where a lot of the vignettes focused. They were at a classified level. So can't get too much more into it other than that, but that's largely what we were looking at is like, how do we improve the speed of decision making, reduce cognitive loads on our warfighters through the introduction of kind of best of class frontier type AI capabilities.
And how many companies are currently participating in the project?
Yeah, so I think we had about 20 companies represented at the tabletop, and almost all of them are still involved in one way or another. I think we have between like 9 and 11 of the companies that are deeply involved in the lines of effort. Some of them are, unique to one use case. Several of them are cross-cutting, but even the ones that, didn't have like a role or a niche on one of the use case teams, a lot of them are helping through like enterprise advisory on like, how they can kind of approach it. And they're sort of helping self-organize and syndicate the industry partners. And then there's even things that, are sort of tangential to the overall effort. Like I said, we had a lot of manufacturing and supply chain companies in there. They're looking at like, how can we better partner together to, digitize our inventory, approach contested logistics better, advanced manufacturing. Like these have given rise to sort of related efforts like we're getting at through our strategic capital initiative. And then even things just like contracting, like how do these large scale enterprises do commercial contracting on their side? What lessons can we learn? What tools can we pull? So it's been a really positive outcome in terms of really kind of deepening the connective tissues between us and some of these key industry partners. But I think, like I said, out of the 20, there's about 9 to 11 that are doing the lion's share of the lift on the actual lines of effort in the use case teams.
Let's go through the teams. You have Team Gray that's working to automate PPBE or the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process. Could you talk about what parts of that process you're prioritizing and who gets to use those tools first?
Yeah, great question. So PPBE it's an extremely complicated process, and it just has a lot of interrelated, activities that kind of occur throughout the year across commands through different verticals within HQDA. And so we're taking other steps to kind of re-examine that process from top to bottom. But our approach here in ARIA was to seek or to identify the elements of the PPBE process that AI, like we're most shovel ready for AI to come in and benefit and help posture us for future capability integration. So one of the big lessons was, our data, the state of our data. We still have a lot of disparate business systems that don't talk to each other, databases kind of all over the place that low veracity because they're largely dependent on manual data entry. They're not really harmonized or easily joined. So like we still, had a lot of work to do there to just kind of set conditions for AI to even come in and kind of ride on top and provide a solution. And so, we needed to move those databases around, collapse some business systems into a cloud-based environment that AI could actually access. And that resulted in a kind of peripheral benefit of sunsetting a number of legacy systems, which has already saved us, several $1 million, and we're retiring 33 more systems, converging another 12. And that consolidation is going to save close to $100 million in FY26 and about another $70 million in 27. So this is an exercise that's kind of like self-funding in many respects. And again, like I said, most of those databases are kind of siloed and they reside in obsolete environments. And so one of the most challenging aspects of PPBE is accounting for the execution portion of that process. So then, we can look at the numbers, but they don't always explain like why we made a decision. And so what this is ultimately going towards is a capability that, either G8 or, one of our kind of the vertical that really manages a lot of our resourcing decisions in how we program, but they can provide Army senior leaders with an ability to kind of run almost like a Monte Carlo sim in terms of querying, if we make this change on end strength, what are the second and third order effects that might have on munitions purchasing capability? Right now, that's all manually done. It takes a lot of people, a lot of time to come back with answers. And so, kind of one vignette of how this has already been utilized is we were able to look at, the Army activities and resourcing at one of our contingency locations in Africa to help inform basing decisions. And we did a comparison where we used the AI tool and it was able to pull that information within a few minutes. By comparison, it took the same question about, we gave that, took 3 resource managers about 2 weeks to pull the same information. And the results were very similar. The AI was probably a little more accurate in the ultimate analysis. And so I think that was kind of like a real selling point to the enterprise to like, hey, these capabilities can actually help us move a lot quicker and have more effective decision-making process, speed and quality of decision-making. So that's, I think, where it's going to reside mostly right now. It's being developed, but that's kind of being fed in to our PPBE process as we speak.
That's Deputy Undersecretary of the Army David Fitzgerald speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, unpaid bills at DHS are testing how long critical homeland security missions can hold. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize, secure operations, and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As unpaid DHS contractor invoices stretch back nearly 9 months, companies supporting critical homeland security missions say workforce stability and operational readiness are increasingly at risk. With Congress still weeks away from funding relief, the question is how long that capacity can be sustained. Here to break down those impacts is Stephanie Costro, president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, great to have you on this morning. Thanks for joining me.
As always, thanks, Terry, for having me.
We continue to follow the DHS funding dilemma. Last week, the Senate sent a budget resolution to the House asking for funding for CBP and ICE. Over the weekend, the events at the White House Correspondent Dinner reminded us that the Secret Service is part of Homeland Security and still not officially funded. What is the status of contractors who are being affected by this long DHS lapse in funding?
Terry, it seems that we should be past talking about this at this point. You and I have had this conversation about the DHS, the status of DHS appropriations now. as we are well past the 2-month mark, right, of DHS operating under conditions of a shutdown. I would note a few things, Terry. One is, the president signed out a memo wherein many civil servants who are working for the Department of Homeland Security are receiving at least partial paychecks. They are getting some funding flowing directly to the employees of the department. That said, we are still facing headwinds when it comes to payments on contracts and invoice payments. And so I would like to highlight for you a couple of different things. One is when we had the former, now Homeland Security Secretary, she would have to review any payment of $100,000 or more across the department, whether it is a contract or grant. That obviously added additional time to contracting and to payments on contracts. That said, when you are in conditions of a shutdown, one of the easiest things to cut right initially is invoice payments. And we have seen a lapse in prompt payment of DHS invoices that dates back well before the shutdown, all the way back to last summer. We are talking to some PSC member companies who provide important solutions, critical solutions for government missions at DHS that have not had invoices paid since last August. This is an issue, particularly for small businesses who just don't have lines of credit or the fiscal wherewithal to sustain this over the long term. They are in a world of pain right now, Terry.
Stephanie, you mentioned contractors performing mission essential functions. Many of DHS's subordinate agencies are engaged in ongoing operations, combat operations. How is their inability to pay their own workforce affecting their ability to support these critical missions?
That is a great question, Terry. Contractors are partners to their agency customers. And in that spirit of partnership, a lot of companies are doing everything they can to make sure that the work is being done. But it is disheartening to see that invoices are going unpaid, that it is taking quite a long time to get their employees paid, and they are losing elements of their workforce simply because they can't afford to stay in a government contract line of business any longer. You mentioned earlier the budget resolution that was passed by the Senate last week, and that sent instructions to committees to go ahead and provide some funding for immigration and border security operations, where contractors do play an essential role. And the instructions that were given to the committees as they start to think about this, and I want to just highlight for your listeners, Terry, the committees on the judiciary and on Homeland Security in the Senate have until May 15th to provide legislation that would fund immigration and border security operations to the tune of some $140 billion over the next 10 years. And so that money would cover ICE, Customs and Border Protection, et cetera, in the near term. And so our contractors are watching that very, very closely. That said, May 15th is still several weeks away. And as I mentioned, small businesses are in some cases facing an existential question of whether they want to stay in this line of business.
And that budget resolution only covers that mission area, Customs and Immigration. It does not cover Coast Guard, FEMA, CISA, other sorts of functions inside the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, if you look at what comprises the Department of Homeland Security, there's so many components in there. We talked about the TSA in the past, about the Transportation Security Administration and what they're doing at airports. I, for one, have been through airports recently, and I did not face long lines, but I may be in the minority. I'm not sure. That said, you mentioned Secret Service and the active role they are always playing to protect and to serve. And this past weekend, they were called to take actions that were horrible to see what happened at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And as we move forward, I think it's important to recognize that we owe it to these civil servants and their contracting partners to get them paid so they can go grocery shopping, they can put fuel in their car, et cetera. I think that can't be understated.
Stephanie, I mean, as we just said, these contractors are supporting wartime operations, critical national functions. Is there anything at this point that would break this logjam and help it move faster?
So the instructions for the committees are, as I mentioned, to have them come back with proposed legislation by May 15th. We can fast track legislation after we get those. And, the committees can choose to provide that legislation before May 15th. And so encouraging those committees to move quickly, I think, is important. And then to have the House and the Senate move quickly thereafter. The president has set a June 1 deadline for this piece of legislation to get through. And my understanding is once that is through and immigration and border security are set, then the Congress may then turn to the rest of the DHS appropriations. And so as soon as we can get these bills through, the better.
Stephanie Castro is president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, let's turn our attention to something maybe less focused on national security, but no less of a focus for contractors. OMB released a memo earlier this month to the agencies on procurement of commercial items. There was a lot in this. Kind of walk us through the headlines and the things that your community is paying attention to.
It always amazes me, Terry, how much information and content there can be in a fairly short memo. And so just as a reminder to your listeners, last year there was an executive order on ensuring, and I'm just going to, the name of it was Ensuring Commercial Cost-Effective Solutions in Federal Contracts. So a year has passed, and this memo comes out specifically to help reinforce that executive order. And so on April 17th, OMB signed this out to agencies to really focus on what they can buy in commercial contracting. And so it's asking those agencies to scrub all of their contract awards over the last 6 months or so to say, here's what we bought. And if it had been non-commercial, here's why we couldn't buy it in a commercial way. This harkens back to a conversation, Terry, you and I had on the current executive branch's focus on firm fixed price contracts, where, you buy in a commercial way a widget, a solution, a service, and then you pay a specific price for it, as opposed to cost reimbursable. For your listeners who are in contracting, that is when the contractors provide an invoice that says, here's what it cost us, please reimburse us for the cost of it, and there may be an add-on margin there. The executive branch currently is really looking at moving everything to firm fixed price, more commerciality, more commercial solutions. And what OMB has done in this memo is not only ask for that scrub of recent contract awards, that information is due by May 4th, but it's also instituting a new consultation process with OMB if agencies want to buy non-commercially. And so this adds a layer of bureaucracy, a layer of difficulty really in getting contracts out the door if they choose to go non-commercial. This, of course, is to encourage them to buy commercially.
And there's still question about what exactly commercial is.
There is. I would say there is disagreement between the government and industry regarding some element of commercial contracts. And I'll give you an example. If a company is providing a solution to, say, another company in support of a federal contract, they're the subcontractor, right? The government considers that to be a commercial contract between the sub and the prime. However, there are flow down requirements. So the subcontractor actually has to comply with federal requirements. So it's not a purely commercial take on it. There are, if you are in the defense space or the Department of War space, you have to be compliant with the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, CMMC. That's going to cost you as a subcontractor. So it's not really a commercial contract in the eyes of industry, but it is in the eyes of the government. And so as we move forward, these are conversations we need to have.
What is the contract community going to need to do to prepare to be compliant with the direction here?
So we are watching this very, very closely to see how agencies are going to justify some of their non-commercial contracting decisions over the last 6 months. And moving forward, we're going to have to look as a community of contractors at, how can we integrate commercial solutions as part of the overall solution as a prime contractor? What do the flow down requirements look like? And what happens when commercial off-the-shelf technology doesn't fit the need of the mission? And you really do have to go non-commercial because it has specific government requirements. How do we support acquisition professionals in the government in making those justifications? That's going to add quite a bit of work, but we can roll up our sleeves and do this together.
Stephanie Castro is president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining me today.
Terry, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, around the world, governments are adapting to sustained pressure and not waiting for stability to return. But first, modernizing preparedness law means asking whether long-standing systems are built to last over time. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Modernizing preparedness law requires more than updating language or refreshing authorities. It means confronting where coordination, capacity, and accountability have fallen short under stress as threats have evolved. Here to walk through some key considerations is U.S. Policy and Advocacy Officer at the Global Health Technologies Coalition, Alex Long. Alex, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to talk about the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, now titled Protecting Americans from All Hazards Preparedness Act. This act was authorized 20 years ago and it's been through several different reauthorizations. In its growth or its maturity, how would you say it has changed for the better and then maybe not changed where it should?
It's a great question. So, in 2006, when it was first passed, I think the two backbones, let's say, of the legislation were the creation of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response and the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, which is ASPR and BARDA. Now, ASPR was tasked with handling public health emergencies and coordinating them, or emergencies that dealt with CBRN threats, which is chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. And then BARDA was tasked with distributing and developing countermeasures very quickly to address the threat. So if that's where we started in 2006, I think it's really important for people to understand why that was created. And it was in response to 9/11 and the anthrax attacks of 2001, which I know 2006 feels like a long way away from 2001, but there was a lot going on. And that was the impetus. So through its other reauthorizations in 2013 and 2019, different events preceded those reauthorizations of the original 2006 bill, which gets to your question where it has evolved because it's had to. So in 2013, when Congress took another crack at it to reauthorize, we had just been through H1N1. And we realized that our response capabilities were not ready for pediatric issues. So within the 2013 bill, it addressed more pediatric medical countermeasures and the creation and response to pediatric communities. And then the 2019 bill, we had just gone through Ebola and Zika, which were two infectious diseases. And we realized that in 2006, I think most of the capacities that PAPA set up were for man-made biological threats. And we were increasingly coming into a world that was very global, a lot of travel, et cetera. So infectious diseases and disease spread needed to be centerpiece to this 2019 piece of legislation. So it evolved to kind of meet that moment. I would say now that we're 20 years into this process, as you could imagine, the next PAPA hopefully could address and could evolve to address the shortcomings that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, one would hope that we wouldn't have any trouble reauthorizing it with COVID sort of still in recent memory, but the authorization actually lapsed in 2023, and we haven't been able to move forward an agreed upon reauthorization. How is Health and Human Services thinking about all hazard preparedness today?
I know that the people who are working within ASPR and BARDA right now, it is still central and very important, especially with rising threats that are brought to us because of, emerging technologies and AI. But without going down that rabbit hole, I do know that the people working there are really focused on this issue. And I think that what they're looking for is a signal from Congress that Congress is also focused on this issue. And the reason why we're here today to talk about 20 years of PAPA and to talk about a potential reauthorization is because it seems like there might be some motivation on behalf of Congress. But without that authorization, without a new PAPA, we're a little bit in the dark as to what we should be doing next as a country. And I think that, again, agency officials are looking for those directives from Congress.
In the different competing versions of reauthorization proposals that have been offered but not passed yet, what would you say are some of the critical modernization efforts that they've included?
So back in 2023 was the last time that Congress really tried to reauthorize PAPA post-COVID. And without getting into too many of the details there, it was really just a very partisan situation that kind of led to it not seeing the light of day and getting passed. So within this new PAPA that we're hopefully going to be able to push through in this Congress, which I should mention is highly unlikely, but something that we could really hope for, we don't really know what is going to be in there right now because the process is so in its infancy, and I think that's really important to mention. But I will say, we learned a lot from the pandemic and from what we do have and from what we don't have. And one thing that we really learned, especially through BARDA's Operation Warp Speed, is that if you give a lot of money and a lot of focus to a problem, BARDA is able to solve it. And I think the Operation Warp Speed is an incredible success. But I would be remiss to not mention the fact that that money that got to BARDA to tackle the COVID-19 vaccines was done through emergency appropriations and an emergency supplemental. So I think a lot of people in the global health community and the biosecurity community are really looking for Congress to vest BARDA with more explicit funding for emerging infectious diseases so that we don't have to go through the process of doing an emergency supplemental for funding when an emergency is already here. And I think, we saw that with Ebola and Zika too. Those responses were also funded through emergency supplementals rather than a standalone program that had a sort of war chest ready for the moment. And I think through new PAPAs, we could hopefully get some sort of increased funding for threats of that nature, and also, supply chain issues that we saw when people aren't countries are not engaging in trade anymore with us. And then also just the strategic national stockpile and understanding what is in it and where those things are across the nation, I think is another big push for the next PAPA.
I'm speaking with Alex Long. He's U.S. Policy and Advocacy Officer at Global Health Technologies Coalition. Alex, you've talked there a lot about the medical challenges that are associated with this. I want to talk about organizational challenges for a minute, because PAPA touches multiple agencies: Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, the FDA, and others. What are some of the cross-agency collaboration challenges that you'd want PAPA to address?
Yeah, so PAPA set up the FEMC, or Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasures Enterprise. So again, I will call it FEMC from here on out. And that includes all of the agencies that you just mentioned. And one way that FEMC really works well is Department of Homeland Security is able to identify different material threats, put together a list. BARDA is then able to take that list, create medical countermeasures for it, and then the FDA is able to move those through in an expedited way if a threat is imminent. So that's one way that coordination really works across these agencies. But I think one thing that it's currently missing is an interplay from the Department of State. This administration has really centralized a lot of global health at the Department of State and global health security. And I do believe that, especially if we want to have a FEMC that is forward-looking and monitoring the threats all across the world, incorporating the Department of State into it would probably be beneficial. But then also, I think since COVID and since we didn't have another PAPA, there have been really great strides made in a bipartisan manner, which I cannot emphasize enough is so necessary to biosecurity as bipartisan bills. There have been many that have been passed since COVID that set up certain offices across the U.S. government, and I would love to see in the next iteration of PAPA those offices having clear marching orders and coordination mechanisms so that during maybe the next threat, whether it be biological, chemical, radiological, or nuclear, there's a clear messaging strategy from the administration and from the right people, from the right organizations. And I think that we saw that during COVID, the messaging wasn't perfect. So I think strengthening that and strengthening these new offices and giving them a real place in this response process is critical.
That's really helpful. But let's follow through what's likely to happen, which, as you said up front, is not reauthorization. So in the absence of reauthorization, what do you think are the biggest risks out there that this network of agencies and organizations and projects is going to have to deal with?
Well, I think funding and strategy are two things that all of the different agencies that are incorporated in PAPA really need, which is why a PAPA would be so great to, if not pass in this Congress, the next one. And again, it's currently being led by Representative Neil Dunn, Representative Lori Trahan in the House, a new effort to put it back on the docket and back into the conversation, which is the first step. Hopefully their Senate colleagues will agree and, take it up as well. And then we can have some sort of bicameral, bipartisan process. That would be perfect. But as you said, potentially unlikely. So what has been able to happen since the reauthorization lapse in 2023 is congressional appropriators have kept funding and kept reauthorizing small parts of PAPA through appropriations bills, which happen every year. So we have been lucky that there is clear push to fund those things, but to make sure that that funding does not lapse and that because there is no authorization, funding does not follow. Funding usually is much stronger if there is authorization attached. And that allows the agency to put together 5-year plans that would give people more foresight who are on the ground, actually contractors for BARDA, so that they could build their own company strategies and organizational strategies around BARDA's new strategy, which a PAPA would allow for. So there's all of those issues, plus we don't know what the next threat is. So I think that we're in a really tough spot if we don't somehow get this conversation back moving, and if not passing this Congress, then the next one.
I've been speaking with Alex Long. He's U.S. Policy and Advocacy Officer at Global Health Technologies Coalition. Alex, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, around the world, governments are adapting to sustained pressure and not waiting for stability to return. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Drawing on experiences from governments across the globe, a new trends report focuses less on prediction and more on how public institutions respond when resources are tight and systems are under strain. We'll talk about what those shared lessons suggest for decision-making ahead with the Executive Director of the Center for Government Insights at Deloitte, Bill Eggers. Bill, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you.
It's so great to be with you as always, Terry.
We are going to dig into Deloitte's 2026 Government Trends Report. But before we talk about 2026, I want to turn the clock back a little bit and talk about 2025. It was a tumultuous year for federal agencies here in the U.S. and for governments worldwide. This is a global report that you guys are talking about. How did all of the disruption in 2025 affect what rose to the top of your list in trends for 2026?
Well, the biggest takeaway from 2025 was that the environment has just outpaced the way it was designed. We're now operating in an environment defined by AI accelerating quickly. You've got tighter fiscal constraints worldwide, workforce strain, risks that cascade across systems as we're seeing on almost a daily basis. And in that context, incremental reform really struggles to keep up. That's why this year's trends moved down upstream. Instead of focusing on improving delivery at the margins, we really focus on redesigning how government actually works. Its rules, workflows, decision rights, platforms, learning loops. And for federal agencies, there really are a few practical implications. And the first is that you can't wait for stability to return. The environment isn't going to slow down. And second, technology alone won't fix broken processes. The biggest gains come when AI is paired with simpler rules, redesigned workflows, clearer accountability. And we're already starting to see that. At the IRS, they were able to simplify internal rules and then apply an automated contract review tool to reduce review times from hours to just minutes. And that's really the broader point, is that technology delivers the most value when it reinforces redesign, not when it's layered onto complexity.
Bill, one of the things that the Trump administration did last year was sort of sweep out a lot of bureaucratic underbrush. Regardless of whether you think they did it right or wrong, a lot of obstacles to change like that are removed now. So how does that, for federal agencies who are thinking about change, give them a clearer path? Does it erase the old whiteboard and now they can write something new?
I think there's so many opportunities right now to really change and redesign the whole operating system of government. And that is one of the biggest messages from trends this year. When we look at trends over time, we've looked at digitization, future readiness, breaking silos, delivery excellence, and this time they all come together into this deeper area in terms of a new operating system. And so that's what we mean by changing the machinery underneath government. And there's an incredible opportunity to do that, whether it's rules and workflows, partner ecosystems, feedback loops. And so the shift is really about moving from reform as an event to adaptation as a system. And that's really a fundamental change. And it also changes, Terry, the way we think about AI. In earlier editions and in other discussions we've had, AI really showed up as an enabling capability. But in 2026, it's embedded in how government works, in service delivery, regulation, procurement, workforce design. So for federal agencies, the question is no longer where should we pilot AI, but how do we redesign work, redesign systems and accountability around it?
Bill, I want to go back to something that you said about the government operating systems, the way that work is designed and gets done. And of course, the report argues for the need to change rapidly. And yet we certainly find in our own country that there are a lot of organizations that are literally invested, like have money riding on the status quo. So for an innovative government leader, it can be really hard to overcome that inertia, that focus on keeping things the same. How do you see governments around the world overcoming that?
Well, I think there's always been that issue, of course, Terry, in government and in private companies and all kinds of systems like that. That's not new. But what we are seeing today, I think, is that the pressures to change between tighter resources and these sort of massive changes brought about by AI have become a real forcing function. And I think that what we're seeing around the world is that forcing function is actually causing a lot of that inertia to start to go away in different ways, because you simply cannot face today's challenges with an industrial age government operating model. And that's really a theme of the trends. And we focus on a lot of innovators in the My Takes who are just doing amazing things, whether it's Santi Garces in Boston around permitting reform, or we look at Sydney Metro Station and what Peter Regan has done using public-private partnerships to modernize that system in a way that would have been almost unthinkable just a few years ago, where it's all autonomous and they brought in billions of dollars of private capital into it. So I think the operating environment that governments are operating in is forcing some of these much bigger changes in a way that I don't think we've seen in years, if not decades.
I'm speaking with Bill Eggers. He's the executive director of the Center for Government Insights at Deloitte. Well, Bill, some of those examples you just rattled off sounded like people fairly high up in their organizations who have authority over change. But not everybody that's listening to our conversation right now has responsibility or controls budget or strategy. So for folks who are in the middle of an organization and want to try to change their operating space, how should they apply these trends to what they're working on?
Well, I think for most career staff and others, the biggest takeaway isn't necessarily that they always have to think bigger. It's to look closer at how their work actually happens. And the Trends Report, I think, is very useful as a lens onto their own workflows. Where are the handoffs? Where is data entered multiple times? Where are approvals adding time but not value? And that's where the real opportunity is. And so for program managers, it often means organizing work around outcomes rather than org charts. Instead of asking, which unit owns this, ask, what outcome are we trying to deliver and how should the work be structured around that? Or if you're on an acquisition team, the lesson is pretty straightforward. Simplify before you digitize. You want to strip out unnecessary steps, clarify decision points, and then apply AI and other tools. And that's what we're already seeing with the FAR rewrite of procurement rules. We're seeing that in the DoD with their software acquisition pathway and various other initiatives. And if you're on the regulatory staff, oversight, the shift is really from a blanket review to much smarter reviews. One-stop portals, automated pre-checks, risk-based monitoring. The goal is not less oversight, it's more targeted, more effective oversight. And lastly, for the broader workforce, I think the most practical takeaway is AI fluency. In the report, we frame it pretty simply. We talk about use, choose, and build. What we mean by that is most people need AI to use AI safely in their daily work, and those are the users. Some will need to choose which tools to use and make judgment calls. That is the group around choose. And then a smaller group actually needs to build. And programs like State Chat, the Department of State, show how that can be done responsibly. So I think the practical message is the biggest changes in government won't necessarily start at the top. They'll start where people in the middle of the work actually redesign how that work gets done.
Bill, there's a quote in here that really caught my eye. Agencies that modernize only on the surface may find that old constraints reassert themselves. So if an agency is looking at this and thinking about only maybe acting on one or two ideas, that's all they think they have the capacity for, what would you suggest? Where should they start to make sure that the changes aren't just on the surface?
Well, I'd start with a simple filter. Where is the mission under the most pressure, and where are the conditions already in place to act? So in other words, where is the mission risk high? Where is workforce strain visible? And where does the agency have enough readiness already in terms of their data, authority, leadership support to move right now? So you don't necessarily have to start with the most exciting idea, but you start where the problem is real and the conditions for change exist. And for many federal agencies, that points to things that I mentioned already. Procurement, it's enterprise-wide, measurable, tangible. You can simplify pathways, clarify decision rights, and then apply tools. By applying these technology tools, you can quickly improve speed, supplier access, and outcomes. And that's why the procurement reset we talk about can deliver early wins. And second, human and AI collaboration. It's really not just deploying tools, but redesigning how people and AI work together. That means you have to have clear decision rules, you have to have AI fluency across the workforce, and workflows need to be designed around outcomes, not just processes. Because most agencies, they don't have a technology gap. They have a work design gap. And so if an agency has a strong digital foundation, then it can go further into adaptive operating models with shared platforms and mission teams. And the key is not to start where the trend that they find the most interesting necessarily, but it's to start where redesign will make the biggest difference and can actually stick.
That is a super helpful focus. When you think about that perspective, where do you think the U.S. government will make the most progress in the coming year?
Well, I certainly think in the procurement area, with what's happening in terms of simplifying FAR and the huge momentum around procurement reform, I think that is one area where I see a lot of momentum there. Number two, I think the U.S. government, both at the federal level and we're also seeing at the state and local level, are some of the most aggressive governments in the world right now around actually deploying AI and really looking at all the different processes and looking at how to re-architect and redesign that work around AI. I think the U.S. has a couple years head start in some respects over some other governments that we've seen along those lines. And then also with a lot of the pressures that we're seeing around everything from housing affordability to energy and environment, around regulatory reform and a regulatory reset. that's, I would say the third area where I see a lot of progress already happening and a lot of momentum for further change.
I've been speaking with Bill Eggers. He's Executive Director of the Center for Government Insights at Deloitte. Bill, really appreciate you walking through the headlines of the report with us.
Thanks so much, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. A new acquisition structure has been taking shape within the Army. It shifts the focus away from managing individual programs and toward overseeing portfolios of capabilities. Senior leaders, now known as portfolio acquisition executives, oversee capability areas, while the offices responsible for individual programs have been rebranded from program executive offices to capability program executives. Dennis Teefee is project manager for Command and Control Applications within the new Capability Program Executive for Command and Control Information Network. He talked with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis about the new structure and how it's changing things.
How the Army in the past looked at the programs were very stovepiped. So when I was a PM for tactical radios, I was really concerned about the tactical radios. How do I develop, manage, test, procure, and field those radios across the entire Army? I wasn't really always focused on how does the radio network integrate with all the different warfighting functions? How does the radio network impact how we do command and control? I was just providing a simple capability, and I needed to make sure that I was able to not only field it, but also manage it without any real thought about how we're going to use that across the entire Army. How we're doing it now is each one of those layers, just one component of the entire network. So this breaking up that stovepipe concept is brilliant because we're really making sure that all the different PM shops, as well as the users, our industry base, and our requirements community all fall in on making sure that we have mission success, not individual product success.
And you've also, during TAM, outlined several priorities for the shop, including standing up a DevSecOps pipeline or the sandbox environment, and also building an application storefront. One of your priorities also includes developing warfighting function applications tied to the data layer. Let's talk about the DevSecOps pipeline. Where does the effort stand today, and what are some of the key considerations as you build out this pipeline? What are some of the options that you're weighing in there?
Yeah, so we're super excited about the speed that we're getting after all of those priorities. All the work that we've been doing, prototyping concepts of NGC2 at 4ID and 25ID, really leveraging the partnership between industry, the acquisition community, the development community, and the warfighter users, we're able to really understand the foundational components of what we need to do within C2 apps. What we're doing is understanding what is the best of breed that our industry partners and our team leads are bringing to really inform our acquisition and contracting approach. That acquisition and contracting approach will really give us an opportunity to develop and move forward to each one of those priorities that you lined out. So let me give you an example of what we are doing in each one of those layers. For our DevSecOps pipeline, we've been working hard on our market research, exploring what industry has been doing, what options exist, what our partners are doing in the Air Force and the Navy, and understanding what the technical issues that each one of those stakeholders have experienced as they build it. So we are taking the lessons learned from those prototype efforts, as well as what we're doing with our market research, and combining that into developing what we believe is the pathway for the DevSecOps pipeline. So as of right now, we've established a development and test environment that the Army can start prototyping and working on. And we're now working with other partners within Army and industry in moving that that test and development environment to an actual production environment. And as we exercise that sandbox, we're going to continue to follow the best of breed of industry while also staying in tune with what Army policies and procedures are to make sure that we hit all of our different cybersecurity requirements and maintain pace with the threats that are coming along. On the application storefront, we're a step behind in where we are in the DevSecOps pipeline. And that's okay, because it's important that we have the pipeline established. We understand the policies and the procedures and the technical solutions before we actually get to that storefront. At the TEM that we met at originally, the day before, we met with more than 15 industry partners where we got their feedback of how they thought they can support us in doing an application storefront. And coming out of the TEM, that information from those 15 vendors, as well as what we learned into prototyping, we're about to go out to industry to formalize a request for information to make sure that we codify individuals' input and we push for market research.
All right, a lot to unpack there. Let's go back to the DevSecOps pipeline, and let's start with that market research. Could you talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned from that market research and the type of feedback that you are getting from industry?
Yeah, so this is so critical. We within this organization are focused on being transparent with our users as well as our industry partners. And by doing that, we're finding that they're transparent back to us. So every industry partner that we meet with kind of opens up their books and tells us what went right when they were doing their development process, and more importantly, what went wrong and where they failed and the mistakes that they made along the way. Because they don't want the Army to make the same mistakes that they've made in supporting either their commercial offerings or the work that they've done supporting our sister services. So things such as making sure that we don't lock our requirements so tight that we can't actually pivot along the time. Because if we lock our requirements so tight, when we actually start using it or things change, they have no flexibility and to adapt to that change. They also ask us not to try to bite off everything at once. Make sure that you do a minimal viable capability instead of trying to build the perfect solution up front. They said the key to any storefront is much like the DevSecOps is making sure that you are iterating constantly on it, adjusting to users' feedback, as well as being willing to accept what is the best of breed coming in from industry.
That's Dennis Teefee, the Army's project manager for command and control applications. To watch his full conversation with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis, check out our latest DoD Modernization Exchange at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. As AI continues to deliver real impacts across the government, what can you learn from agencies at the forefront? Join Federal News Network's AI and Data Exchange this week, Wednesday, April 29th and Thursday, April 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern to hear how agencies are scaling AI effectively and securely. Register today at federalnewsnetwork.com. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.